My name is Rachel, and what I've done will haunt me forever. It started with a casual conversation, a harmless glance, but it ended with me standing in the ruins of my life. I betrayed someone who trusted me the most, and I crossed a line I can never come back from. The worst part? It wasn't an accident. I let it happen. If you think you've heard shocking stories before, let me tell you, this one will leave you speechless. Here's how it all began. I had known Sophia since middle school. She was my best friend, the kind of person who could finish my sentences and always knew how to cheer me up. We were inseparable, and even as life took us to different colleges, we stayed close. She was my person, my sister from another family. Her dad, Mr. Blake, was always in the background of our friendship. A successful businessman, he was charming in a way most men his age weren't. He carried himself with confidence, always well-dressed, always composed. But to me, he was just Sophia's dad. Nothing more. That changed one evening. It was a warm Friday night, and Sophia invited me over for dinner. Her dad had recently offered me a part-time position at his company, something to help me get experience while I figured out my career path. I was thrilled about the opportunity, but also nervous. I didn't want to let him down, or worse, mess things up and have it reflect on Sophia. Dinner was casual, with Sophia cracking jokes as usual, but I noticed something different about Mr. Blake that night. His attention wasn't entirely on Sophia or even the conversation, it was on me. His eyes lingered a second too long when I laughed, and his compliments, though polite, felt oddly personal. "You've grown into such a poised young woman, Rachel. You're going to be an asset to the company," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. I thanked him, brushing off the odd feeling in my stomach. He was just being kind, right? As weeks went by, I settled into my new role at his company. The job was everything I could have hoped for, challenging, exciting, and filled with opportunities to learn. But the more time I spent there, the more I noticed Mr. Blake going out of his way to talk to me. At first, it was professional, checking in on my projects, offering advice. But then his questions became personal. "How's your mom? Still in California? What do you do for fun, Rachel? You seem like you'd have an interesting hobby." I didn't think much of it. He was just being friendly. But then there were the small gestures, bringing me coffee just the way I liked it, stopping by my desk more often than necessary. It felt deliberate. One day, after a long meeting, he suggested we grab lunch to discuss my progress. I agreed, thinking it was purely work-related. But as we sat in the quiet corner of a fancy restaurant, his tone shifted. "You know, Rachel, I see a lot of potential in you. Not just professionally, but as a person. You're driven, intelligent, and captivating." I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. Captivating? It wasn't a word you used for a colleague or even a friend's daughter. But before I could say anything, he changed the subject back to work, leaving me to wonder if I had imagined it. That evening, I told Sophia about the lunch. I didn't mention the strange compliment, why would I? It felt like an overreaction. But her response was dismissive. "That's just my dad. He's overly nice sometimes. Don't read into it." I tried to let it go, but the way he looked at me during our next meeting made it impossible. His eyes weren't those of a boss or a father. They were something else entirely. The turning point came at the company's quarterly dinner. Sophia had insisted I come, saying it would be good for networking. The event was glamorous, held in a downtown hotel ballroom. Everyone was dressed to impress, and I couldn't help but feel out of place in my modest dress. But then Mr. Blake found me in the crowd. "You look stunning tonight, Rachel," he said, his voice low. I thanked him, feeling my cheeks flush. I convinced myself it was just a polite compliment, but his next words made my heart race. "You have no idea how hard it is to stay professional around you." I stared at him, speechless. Before I could respond, someone called his name, and he walked away, leaving me stunned and confused. After that night, I couldn't deny the tension between us. His messages became more frequent, more personal. He'd text late at night, asking how I was or if I needed anything. I told myself it was harmless, but deep down, I knew better. One night, I received a message that changed everything. "Do you ever think about me, Rachel? Because I can't stop thinking about you." My hands shook as I read it. This wasn't just a crush or a passing thought. This was a line we were both about to cross. I should have told him to stop, to never contact me again outside of work. But instead, I replied, "What are you trying to say?" Looking back, that was the moment I stepped onto a path I couldn't turn away from. The messages continued, each one pushing the boundaries of what was appropriate. And yet, I didn't stop them. I felt exhilarated, terrified, and completely out of control. Little did I know, Sophia would soon discover the truth, and when she did, everything would fall apart. Mr. Blake's messages became a regular occurrence. At first, they were strictly professional, questions about my projects, reminders about deadlines, but over time, they started to drift into personal territory. He'd ask how my weekend was or whether I'd made any exciting plans for the evening. It was subtle, almost innocent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind his words. One evening, he sent me a message that caught me off guard. "Rough day for you too? Maybe we could grab a coffee after work and unwind." I hesitated, staring at the screen. I knew agreeing to meet him outside the office was risky. He was Sophia's dad, after all, and the potential for complications was massive. But at the same time, there was something undeniably flattering about his attention. Against my better judgment, I replied, "Sure, coffee sounds nice." We met at a cozy cafe near the office, one I'd never been to before. The ambience was perfect, soft lighting, warm tones, and the faint aroma of fresh pastries. Mr. Blake was already there when I arrived, dressed impeccably as usual. He greeted me with a smile that felt far too familiar for a boss. "Rachel, you're a breath of fresh air," he said as we sat down. "I don't get many chances to just relax and talk like this." His words were disarming, and for a moment, I forgot who he was. We talked about everything: work, travel, books. He asked questions that felt deeply personal, and when he listened, it was with such intensity that it made me feel like the only person in the room. At one point, I mentioned my plans to visit a museum over the weekend, and his eyes lit up. "I love museums," he said. "You should let me know next time you're going. Maybe we could explore one together." I laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking or serious. The idea of spending time with him outside the office, in a setting so casual and intimate, felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready for. But the way he looked at me, the way he leaned in as he spoke, it was hard to ignore the connection building between us. After that coffee meeting, things changed. He began texting me more frequently, sometimes late at night. It wasn't inappropriate, at least, not overtly, but the context was becoming less professional. "Hope you had a good day. You were brilliant in the meeting," he wrote once. Another time, "I can tell you're destined for big things, Rachel. Don't let anyone hold you back." His words made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced before, and that was dangerous. The rational part of me knew I needed to set boundaries, but another part, a smaller, more reckless part, enjoyed the attention. One Friday evening, just as I was about to leave work, he appeared at my desk. "Heading out already?" he asked, his tone light but with an edge of disappointment. "Yeah, just tired," I replied, trying to keep things casual. He nodded, then paused. "Well, if you're not in a rush, I was thinking we could grab a quick drink. Just to celebrate a productive week." I wanted to say no, to put an end to this growing familiarity. But instead, I found myself saying, "Okay, just one drink." The bar he chose was upscale and quiet, the kind of place where people went to talk rather than party. As we sipped our drinks, he leaned closer, his voice soft. Rachel, I don't want you to think I'm crossing any lines here, but you're truly extraordinary. You've brought something fresh to my life, and I didn't realize how much I needed that. His words hit me like a tidal wave. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a harmless compliment, but the way he looked at me said otherwise. There was an intensity in his gaze, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the evening in my mind, I felt torn. On one hand, I knew this was wrong. Sophia was my best friend, and Mr. Blake was her father. Whatever connection was forming between us, it wasn't something I could pursue without risking everything. But on the other hand, his attention was intoxicating. He made me feel special, important in a way I hadn't felt in years. And despite my better judgment, I found myself wanting more. I tried to keep my distance after that, avoiding him in the office and keeping my replies to his messages short. But the pull between us was undeniable, and every time I saw him, the tension grew stronger. One evening, he sent me a text that broke the fragile wall I was trying to build. I can't stop thinking about you, Rachel. I hope that's not inappropriate to say. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. I knew I should shut it down, tell him this needed to stop. But instead, I typed back. What are you thinking about? In that moment, I knew I was walking into dangerous territory, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. Our meetings became more frequent, almost ritualistic. They were always carefully planned, away from prying eyes. A quiet restaurant on the edge of town, a park where no one we knew would be. At first, it felt thrilling, like we were stealing moments out of time. But deep down, I knew the truth, secrets like this never stayed hidden forever. One evening, we met at a boutique hotel that Mr. Blake had suggested. I hesitated outside the entrance, my heart pounding in my chest. Was this really who I was becoming? But then he appeared, his presence magnetic, and all my doubts seemed to fade. Rachel, he said softly, stepping closer. I know this isn't conventional. But I can't pretend anymore. What I feel for you, it's real. It's overwhelming. I looked up at him, torn between fear and desire. His words were everything I didn't want to hear and everything I secretly craved. This can't be happening, I whispered. But it is, he replied, his voice steady. And I don't want it to stop. That night, something shifted between us. There was no going back. We crossed a line I'd sworn I never would, and in that moment, I let myself fall into the intoxicating whirlwind of his attention. The world outside felt far away, as if we'd created a bubble where only we existed. But the reality of our situation hit me the next day like a freight train. Seeing Sophia in the office, laughing about something trivial, made my stomach churn with guilt. She had no idea what was happening behind her back, and I couldn't bear the thought of her finding out. Our rendezvous continued, each one pulling me deeper into the web we'd spun. Mr. Blake was attentive, charming, and always so sure of himself. He'd text me sweet nothings in the middle of the day, leaving me smiling like a schoolgirl. Thinking of you, one message read, accompanied by a photo of his morning coffee. Another time, he wrote, counting down the hours until I see you again. It was intoxicating, but also terrifying. The more time I spent with him, the more I realized how much I stood to lose. Every glance Sophia gave me felt like an accusation, even though she didn't know the truth. Yet, one evening, after a particularly long day at work, we found ourselves sitting in his car, parked in a secluded spot by the waterfront. The city lights sparkled on the water, casting a romantic glow over everything. Do you ever regret this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached over, taking my hand in his. Regret isn't the word. This, whatever this is, it feels too right to regret. His words were like a balm to my conflicted heart. But as much as I wanted to believe him, I couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at me. The nights I spent with him were a blend of passion and secrecy, but the days brought nothing but anxiety. Every time Sophia invited me for coffee or asked me to join her for a casual shopping trip, I felt like I was betraying her in the worst possible way. One Saturday, she mentioned her dad in passing, not realizing how her words cut through me like a knife. "Dad seems happier lately," she said with a grin. "Maybe it's the new project at work." I forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, he does seem content." The irony of her statement was unbearable. I was the reason he was happier, and it was a secret I'd have to carry for as long as I could. As weeks turned into months, the weight of our affair became harder to bear. Mr. Blake was relentless in his pursuit, always assuring me that we could keep things discreet. But my fear of being discovered was growing. Every time my phone buzzed, I panicked, wondering if Sophia had found out. "Do you trust me?" he asked one night, his voice firm yet soothing. "I want to," I admitted. "But this can't last forever." He cupped my face in his hands, his gaze unwavering. "I don't want forever. I just want now. With you." Despite his reassurances, the cracks in our carefully constructed facade were starting to show. People in the office began to notice how often we were together, and I could see the questioning glances they threw our way. One colleague even joked, "You and Mr. Blake sure spend a lot of time together. Planning a takeover?" I laughed it off, but my heart raced. The walls were closing in, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And when it did, I wasn't sure I'd survive the fallout. It happened on an otherwise ordinary day, a day that seemed like any other. I was sitting at my desk, buried in paperwork, when Sophia stormed into the office. Her face was flushed with anger, her eyes sharp and blazing. The sight of her immediately sent a chill down my spine. "Rachel," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We need to talk. Now." She slammed the door shut behind her and threw her phone onto my desk. The screen was lit up, displaying a series of messages between her father and me. My heart dropped as I realized what she had seen. The sweet nothings, the plans, the secret words we'd exchanged, they were all laid bare in front of her. "How could you?" she hissed, her voice low but laced with venom. "You're supposed to be my friend. You were supposed to have my back, and instead, you've been with him?" I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say? That I hadn't meant for this to happen? That I didn't plan to fall into this mess? None of it would make a difference. "Sophia, I began, but she cut me off, slamming her hands onto my desk. "Don't you dare try to justify this," she yelled. "You've been lying to me this whole time, sneaking around with my dad. Do you have any idea how disgusting this is?" Her words stung, cutting through me like a knife. I wanted to tell her that I hadn't meant for any of this to happen, that it had started innocently and spiraled out of control. But the look in her eyes told me that nothing I said would matter. "You betrayed me," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "You're supposed to be my friend, Rachel. How could you do this to me? To us?" I stood there, silent, as she let her anger pour out. Every word she said was justified, every accusation fair. But then, her tone shifted. "You think this is over," she said, her voice suddenly calm, which was somehow more terrifying than her shouting. "I'm going to make sure you regret this. Both of you." Before I could respond, she grabbed her phone and stormed out, leaving me standing there, frozen. My mind raced as I replayed the confrontation over and over. How had I been so careless? How had I let it come to this? The rest of the day was a blur. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting a message from Mr. Blake, or worse, a follow-up from Sophia. But the screen remained dark. When I finally made it home that evening, the silence in the apartment was deafening. I sat on the couch, staring at nothing, trying to figure out my next move. I knew Sophia well enough to know that her threats weren't empty. She was going to act, and when she did, it wouldn't be subtle. Sure enough, later that night, my phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Blake. We need to talk. Sophia knows. My heart sank. I knew this was only the beginning of a storm that would upend all of our lives. Sophia wasn't going to let this go, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to face what was coming. The evening started innocently enough, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I had gone to Mr. Blake's house to discuss what we should do about Sophia's discovery. I thought we were going to strategize, figure out a way to salvage what was left of our respective lives. But as soon as I stepped inside and saw the way he looked at me, I knew this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. "Rachel," he said softly, closing the door behind me. His voice carried a warmth that made my heart race and my nerves fray all at once. "I'm sorry for everything. I never wanted things to get this messy." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "We need to figure this out, Mr. Blake," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. But even as I said it, I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. There was something unspoken between us, something I wasn't sure I had the strength to fight. He stepped closer, his presence filling the room. "You don't have to call me that," he said. "Call me Ethan." I froze. It was such a small thing, but the way he said it, so gentle, so personal, made my breath hitch. I glanced up at him, and the intensity in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. "Ethan," I whispered, testing the word. It felt strange, intimate, and somehow wrong. But I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him, a pull that had been growing stronger with every passing day. We sat down to talk, but the conversation quickly veered off course. He asked me about my dreams, my fears, the things I'd never shared with anyone. His words were like a balm, soothing and disarming. Before I knew it, I was laughing, smiling, feeling a connection I hadn't felt in years. But then he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a jolt of energy through my entire body. I should have pulled away, should have said something to stop what was happening. But I didn't. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I can't stop thinking about you." I tried to respond, to tell him that this was a mistake, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself leaning in, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. What happened next was inevitable. The line we'd been dancing around for weeks was finally crossed. It was a moment filled with passion, a moment I knew I'd never forget. But as the night faded into morning, the weight of what we'd done settled over me like a heavy blanket. I woke up the next day, the sunlight streaming through the windows. Ethan was already up, making coffee in the kitchen. For a brief moment, it felt normal, like we were just two people sharing a morning together. But the guilt hit me like a tidal wave, pulling me under. What had I done? How had I let it come to this? As I got dressed and prepared to leave, Ethan stopped me. "Rachel," he said, his voice filled with both tenderness and regret. "I don't regret what happened. But I know this changes everything." He was right. Everything had changed. And as much as I wished I could go back and undo it all, I knew there was no turning back. The consequences of our actions were already set in motion, and there was no escaping them now. I knew Sophia wasn't going to let this go easily, but I underestimated just how far she was willing to go. Her anger wasn't just a fleeting burst of emotion, it was a storm, relentless and calculated. And I was her primary target. It started subtly. A few cold stares, icy silences during family dinners. But soon, her disdain turned into something far more public. Sophia began to spread rumors about me, half-truths laced with venom and carefully chosen words that painted me as the villain in every scenario. "Rachel is nothing but a homewrecker," she hissed to anyone who would listen. "She ruined my father's life and our family." Her words spread like wildfire. Friends who once greeted me with warmth now looked at me with suspicion. My colleagues, who had no idea what was happening in my personal life, started to treat me differently. Whispers followed me everywhere I went, each one feeling like a dagger in my back. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I received a message from a mutual friend. It was a screenshot of Sophia's post on social media. "She's not who you think she is," Sophia had written, accompanied by a vague but damning caption. "People like her destroy lives and walk away without a second thought." The post didn't mention my name outright, but it didn't need to. Everyone knew who she was talking about. I confronted her that night, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and despair. "Why are you doing this, Sophia? Haven't you done enough damage?" She met my gaze with a chilling smile. "Damage? You think I've done damage? You haven't seen anything yet, Rachel." Her calm demeanor terrified me more than her words. She wasn't acting out of impulse, this was a calculated act of vengeance, and I was completely unprepared for it. Sophia began creating scenarios where I looked like the aggressor. She would accidentally bump into me at social events, spilling drinks on herself and accusing me of doing it on purpose. She'd send cryptic messages to Mr. Blake, twisting innocent moments into something sinister. "Rachel's been spending a lot of time with one of her male colleagues," she'd write. "Thought you should know." It worked. I saw the doubt creeping into Ethan's eyes, his once unwavering trust starting to falter. "Are you hiding something from me?" he asked one evening, his voice heavy with uncertainty. I tried to explain, to reassure him, but Sophia's poison had already seeped into his mind. Every time we spoke, her words hung in the air between us, an invisible barrier I couldn't break. But Sophia wasn't done yet. She began attending events where she knew I'd be, ensuring our mutual friends saw her side of the story. She painted herself as the victim, a daughter betrayed by someone she trusted. "She was like a sister to me," she'd say, her voice trembling with faux emotion. "And she stabbed me in the back." Her theatrics were convincing. People rallied around her, offering their support while casting me out. I felt like I was drowning, unable to come up for air. The final blow came when she orchestrated a confrontation at a work event. She arrived uninvited, her entrance dramatic and perfectly timed. "I think everyone here deserves to know the truth," she announced, her voice echoing through the room. She didn't need to say much. The mere presence of Mr. Blake and me together was enough to confirm the rumors she'd been spreading. My colleagues' shocked faces were a stark reminder of how much I had to lose. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the weight of everything crushing me. Sophia had succeeded in isolating me, turning everyone against me. I couldn't even look Ethan in the eye without seeing the doubt she had planted there. I knew I deserved some of this. I had made mistakes, crossed lines I shouldn't have. But the cruelty of her revenge was overwhelming. She had turned my world upside down, and I wasn't sure how to put the pieces back together. Sophia's revenge wasn't just about punishing me. It was about control, about ensuring that I felt every ounce of the pain she believed I had caused her. And in that moment, I realized something chilling: she wasn't going to stop until there was nothing left of me. One day, I made the hardest decision of my life. I ended things with Mr. Blake. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "It's destroying everything." He looked devastated but nodded. "I just wanted to make you happy, Rachel," he said, his voice filled with regret. After that, I tried to rebuild what was left of my friendship with Sophia. I reached out to her, hoping for forgiveness. But her response was cold, final. "We can't be friends anymore, Rachel," she said, her voice like ice. "You betrayed me. I'll never forget that." I was left alone, burdened by the weight of my choices. My reputation was in shambles, and the guilt of what I'd done haunted me every day. But deep down, I knew I'd made the right decision, however painful it was. My actions were wrong, but I tried to make things right in the end. What would you have done in my place? Do you think this outcome could have been avoided? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.